Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It is a common trope that appears at least every 4 years when we are told that this year's election, this election cycle, is the most significant and most pivotal in the history of our country. And so it is again. We're being told that there is this great gap between the two major parties. And I'm willing to agree in one sense that that's true. There's certainly a gap in rhetoric. I don't know that there's a fundamental gap in the principles that govern their understanding of government. That we have big government people on both sides of the aisle. Yes, happily, thankfully, we have one major party that has as part of their platform their commitment to protecting unborn human life, though thus far they haven't had much success, whereas the other party has been on the other side of that most significant issue. Now, I raise this because as I am recording, we have been going through a COVID-19 infected Democratic National Convention. And truth be told, I haven't seen any of it. I've read a little bit about it, but I haven't seen any of it. And what I want to bring to our attention today is how do I put this? Well, just like the Republicans seem to have a disconnect between their own platform, their own ideology, their own talking points on the issue of abortion and what actually gets done in Washington, the same thing, the same level of hypocrisy falls on the other side of the aisle. And that circumstance where that happens, where it's most glaring and where it showed up in this year's Democratic National Convention, is on that movement that we call Me Too. Now, some of you may have forgotten Me Too because it's been pushed a little bit out of the headlines since Harvey Weinstein has been sentenced, since Jeffrey Epstein has died in prison, and since COVID and Black Lives Matter have come to dominate our news cycles. What is the Me Too movement? Well, this was a movement, and some might argue spurred on by excellent work done at the Boston Globe, exposing not just the practice of pedophilia within the Roman Catholic Church, but its cover-up by people in positions of authority. And it went from there to not just those inside the Roman Catholic Church, but people in other parts of the world, including those in Hollywood. And this is what brought down Harvey Weinstein, who was a movie producer who purportedly, and he has been convicted of even worse than this, but purportedly was prone to using that practice that they call the casting couch, that he would dangle choice movie parts before young actresses and trade those parts for sexual favors. And out of that grew even more awareness and commitment to battling sexual discrimination and abuse of power in that kind of realm. We had exposure of claims that oh, what is his name? I can't believe I can't remember his name. The fellow from House of Cards, Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey had very public accusations made against him from young men who had been underage boys when supposedly he accosted them. So that exploded out in Hollywood and became part and parcel of the whole process of the confirmation hearing, speaking of the abortion issue, the confirmation hearing of the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, who had been accused by folks late in the game of some sort of sexual misconduct. And, big brouhaha over that. And the standard line among the people on the left side of the aisle was, we believe victims. And what they mean is, we believe accusers. All it takes to get the presumption of the guilt of the accused is the accusation made by the accuser. That was the progressive, democratic, enlightened perspective to have on these matters. And then it turns out that the Democratic nomination is secured by Joe Biden. And in the weeks and months leading up to that eventuality, Joe Biden faces his own accusations of sexual misconduct, of abusing his power and authority, of using that power and authority to seek sexual favors from those under that power in his own office. This was such a part of the story during the process of the primary season that one of the ladies who wraps herself in the mantle of being progressive and being understanding and buying into this, I believe, the victim's perspective, was one, how do I say this correctly? Kamala Harris, now running as vice presidential candidate with Joe Biden. She publicly, unambiguously, directly accused Joe Biden of being a sexist and of being a racist. And yet, she's running on the same ticket with Joe Biden. But wait, there's more. For years now, we have been aware. There has been no refutation of it, no slander suit about it. We've been well aware that included in various flight manifests of the private plane that Jeffrey Epstein typically flew guests to his private island, included on that list was one William Jefferson Clinton. Now we know that President Clinton, while he was president, abused his office by taking advantage of Monica Lewinsky, because there was a profound power gap between the two of them. She was an intern. He was the president of the United States, the most powerful man on the planet. He took advantage of her. He admitted to the relationship eventually when the dress came forth, but he denied that this was a terrible thing. So we already know this about him, and yet he's on this plane with Jeffrey Epstein on the way to Jeffrey Epstein's private island. And he is chosen to address the Democratic National Convention. Now, please don't misunderstand me. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are socialists, there are libertarians. It doesn't take any particular political ideology to be guilty of misusing one's office, to be guilty of being unfaithful to one's spouse. That kind of behavior, I wouldn't be surprised that it's rampant in Washington. Again, on both sides of the aisle. We have a sitting president who has, along the way, said some profoundly coarse things and boasted about bedding various and sundry women who were not his wife. That's one thing. It's a bad thing. It's another thing altogether to drive cancel culture and turn around and ignore the monsters on your own side of the aisle. I mean, seriously, I don't understand. Well, I do actually. I was going to say, I don't understand how you can allow your rhetoric to reach such a fevered pitch when you're talking about the Republicans, and then when it comes to the Democrats, it's crickets. Except for this, I think it goes back to a piece I wrote earlier about this defining moment of the crazy world we live in. When we were told by people in positions of political power and authority that we must not congregate in large numbers, we must shelter in place, we must be quarantined, we must stay in our home unless we want to go out and protest racism, unless we want to go out and honor John Lewis at his death. Now, I'm not comparing actions, I'm comparing words. We were literally told you have to stay home unless you're out protesting about George Floyd. It's a defining moment because what it says is, I'm going to lie right into your face. You're going to know it. I'm going to know it. Everybody within earshot's going to know it. And nobody's going to flinch. It is a 2 + 2 = 5 kind of lie. And it is the exact same thing. To pick up the mantle of compassion and concern for the victims of sexual harassment and choose as your standard bearer Joe Biden and as your senior statesman Bill Clinton. It's raw, indifferent slaps in the face. We don't believe you're going to care. We don't believe you're going to hold us to be consistent. We don't believe you're going to even acknowledge that we've just lied to you. We believe we're going to get away with this. Now, friends, I'm not saying I know whether or not Joe Biden's guilty of anything. I don't know whether he is or not. I do know about Bill Clinton because it's very public. But I also know this. Politicians will say anything if they think it will help them get elected. You know, years ago, I made some sweeping comment about how crooked they all were. I was in seminary. And one of my friends in seminary said, whoa, wait a minute. I agree with you that most of them are, but, you know, I think there are exceptions. He said, I worked on the campaign for Jesse Helms. Some of you are old enough to remember Jesse Helms. Great conservative icon who served for decade after decade for North Carolina. He picked Jesse Helms, who for many reasons I have a lot of admiration for. But I said to him, I said, really, you want to pick Jesse Helms? You think he's an honest man? You think when Jesse Helms puts his hand on the Bible and he swears to protect and defend the Constitution, do you really believe that he thinks that among the enumerated powers in the Constitution is a proviso that gives the federal government authority to subsidize tobacco farmers? See, when he was getting votes, all of a sudden, things changed. Friends, don't be like that. And don't support politicians who are. The last time we were doing another one of our Bible in 5 minutes segments, I made the argument that our fear of numbers is profoundly misplaced, that while I recognize that there are sections in the Pentateuch that can be tough sledding, either because there's a lot of esoteric laws or a lot of names and genealogies or a lot of specifications for the clothing of the Levites or the building of the tabernacle, all those things that are not dynamic action kind of things to read, that actually in the book of Numbers we have a lot going on, a lot of relational issues, a lot of action taking place. Well, even if I'm right, when you turn the page and you come to the subject of this particular segment, Deuteronomy, you may feel frustrated again. Literally, the name of the book means the second law, and one can certainly see in it a great deal of law that has already been covered. But if you look at it for what it is, it becomes something profoundly different. Because what we have in the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell sermon to the people that God had put him in charge of. This is 40 years of traveling together in the wilderness, of all of the frustrations that Moses went through because of the grumbling and complaining of those under his care, but his tenderness, his willingness to receive God's judgment in their place in a very Christ-like kind of way. It should come to us as something powerful and beautiful. You may miss that it is a sermon because of the Deuteronomos element in it. That is, that Moses repeats elements of the law that have already been covered. In fact, one of the things we find in the book of Deuteronomy is a repetition of the Ten Commandments. But that should teach us something. Here is a God-inspired sermon. And in the midst of that sermon, there is God, through Moses, admonishing his people to keep his law. Well, we have this idea in the modern church, in the evangelical church, that we have to not allow law to overcome grace. And I get the motive behind that. I appreciate the motive behind it. I believe in the motive behind it. But I think it misses something about the nature of the law. The law, as I like to put it, is always and everywhere an invitation to joy. That what Moses is doing here is not scolding God's people. He's not saying, I'm not going to be here with you and you better get this right or terrible things are going to happen. He is telling them, look, God loves you. God's blessed you. He's blessed us. We're about to go into this promised land. When you get there, live this way. And God will bless you. It'll go well with you. One of my favorite parts of the book of Deuteronomy is near the end, where Moses lists the ways that God's judgment will come when we disobey. Why? Well, there are two reasons for that. One, because hardship is inherent in our disobedience. That is, it's part and parcel of what comes out of it. I don't want us to ever think that the law of God is something sort of random and that God sits in his heavens with a box full of lightning bolts on one side and a box full of rose petals on the other side. And when we do wrong, he hurls thunderbolts at us, and the thunderbolt really has nothing to do with the law. Or when we do well, he throws rose petals at us, but the rose petals have nothing to do with it. No. Obedience brings blessing in itself. And disobedience brings hardship in itself. Without God having to do anything special or anything extra to make that come to pass. Don't be afraid, pastor, to enjoin your people to do what God commands, not so that they might have favor with God, not that they might be proud of themselves, but because that is where you find joy. That is where you find the life we were made to live. Moses understood that, and Moses, in loving the sheep under his care, takes it upon himself, knowing he's not going to be able to cross over into the other side. He takes it upon himself to remind them, to preach to them, to call them to the blessings of obedience. The obedience itself, friends, is what makes the land, the promised land, a land of rest, a land flowing with milk and honey. Go there with an attitude of selfishness. Go there with an attitude of pride. And no matter how much honey flows, no matter how much milk flows, things will go badly. Oh, that we would learn this lesson well, that we would look at God's law. Yes, as a goad to drive us to Christ. No, never as a way to earn God's favor, but as a receiving of God's favor as he directs us in the way we should live. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.